The man lived a quiet life on the edge of a small town. His house stood near a line of old trees where birds sang in the morning, and the sun always found a way through the branches. He liked the silence there. After so many years of noise, shouting, and danger, peace felt like the only thing he needed. He didn't talk much about his past. People in town only knew him as the polite man who fixed things, broken fences, old tractors, and sometimes even radios that hadn't worked in years. He worked slowly and carefully, never in a hurry. He kept to himself, always calm, always respectful. The folks at the grocery store liked him because he never complained, even when things got hard. He didn't have many friends, but he didn't seem lonely either. Every morning he would drink his coffee on the porch and watch the sunrise. Sometimes he'd close his eyes, take a deep breath, and whisper something to himself. No one ever heard what he said, but it always made him smile for a second. What the people didn't know was that this man had lived many lives before this one. He had seen things most people could never imagine. Years ago, he served his country in places no one talked about on the news. He had been trained to survive in the harshest conditions, to face danger head-on, and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But those days were long gone now. He didn't wear the uniform anymore. He didn't tell stories or show off medals. To him, that part of his life was finished. Still, even when he tried to leave it behind, that old discipline never left him. He woke up at the same time every day, cooked his breakfast the same way, and made sure his tools were always lined up perfectly. If someone saw him from a distance, they might think he was just another quiet man living alone. But there was something about his posture, the way he moved, the calmness in his eyes. It hinted at a strength that came from a place deeper than muscle. For a long time, life stayed peaceful. But peace doesn't always last. It started with small things. A car slowing down in front of his house. A few strangers staring a little too long when he walked into town. Quiet laughter behind him when he passed by. At first he ignored it. He'd seen worse in his life. Words didn't bother him, but the looks grew bolder, the whispers louder. Some people in town didn't like outsiders, especially someone who looked different. It wasn't new to him. He had faced that kind of thing before. Still, it was different this time. This wasn't the battlefield. These were supposed to be neighbors. One afternoon, when he went to buy supplies, he noticed a few young men standing near his truck. They were laughing about something, pretending not to see him. When he got closer, he saw they had scratched something on his door, a rough, ugly word. He didn't react. He just looked at it quietly, then wiped it off with his sleeve. The young men waited for a reaction, but he gave them none. That silence made them uncomfortable. He drove home without saying a word, but something inside him shifted. He knew how these things started. He had seen hatred before, in other countries, in other forms. It always began small, then grew into something people couldn't control. That night he sat on his porch longer than usual. The sky was full of stars, and the wind moved softly through the trees. He thought about the men he had served with, the people he had lost, and the promises he had made to himself when he came back. Promises about peace, restraint, and forgiveness. He didn't want to break those promises, but he also knew peace could not exist without boundaries. The next day, he went about his work as usual. He helped an old neighbor fix a water pump, repaired a fence for another, and didn't mention a thing about what had happened. His calmness made people trust him even more. But a few of the younger men in town saw his kindness as weakness. They thought he was afraid. Over the next few weeks, more things happened. Someone left trash in his driveway. Another day, a glass bottle broke near his porch at night. One morning, he found his mailbox smashed. Still, he said nothing. He just cleaned up quietly and carried on. Some of his neighbors noticed what was happening but didn't say much. A few were afraid to get involved. Others didn't want to believe it was really happening in their town. Inside, though, the man was watching everything carefully. He noticed the tracks near his house, the footprints, the timing of when the noises came. His mind, sharp as ever, was piecing everything together. He wasn't angry, just alert. Years of training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. And right now, calm was his greatest weapon. One evening, as he was closing his shop, a woman from town stopped by to thank him for fixing her porch steps. She mentioned that some young men had been bragging about teaching that man on the hill a lesson. The woman didn't mean harm. She thought it was just foolish talk. But he understood it differently. It was a warning. He nodded politely, thanked her, and went home. That night, He made sure every window was locked, every light turned off. He didn't sleep much. He sat by the window, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. The wind moved through the leaves, and once in a while a dog barked somewhere far away. His instincts told him something was coming, though he didn't know when. The next morning he woke up early and went about his normal routine. He cooked breakfast, checked his tools, and fixed the gate by the road. Nothing seemed out of place, but he could feel the tension growing like a storm waiting to break. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't call the police. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to stay still and let people show their true colors. One afternoon he went to the local diner. A few of the same men who had been following him were there. They laughed louder when he entered. One of them made a comment under his breath, something about not belonging here. The man didn't respond. He simply ordered his food, ate quietly, and left. His silence made them even angrier. They wanted to see fear, but all they saw was calm. Later that night, as the town went quiet, those men gathered again. They had been drinking, talking too big, and trying to prove something to each other. Their laughter turned into plans, foolish, dangerous plans. They wanted to make him pay, to scare him enough to leave town. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Back at his house, the man felt a strange stillness in the air. Years of experience had sharpened his senses to feel danger before it arrived. He stood outside on his porch looking at the dark road below. The wind carried the faint sound of voices, far away but getting closer. He didn't move. He just stood there steady and silent like he had done 1,000 times before in the field. He wasn't afraid. Fear was something he had learned to control long ago, but there was sadness in his eyes. Sadness that even after all he had given to his country, after all the battles he had fought to protect people's freedom, he still had to face hate in his own home. He looked up at the sky and whispered quietly, "Peace. Just peace." Then he turned off the porch light and went inside. He sat in his chair, hands folded, eyes on the window. The night stretched on, quiet and heavy. He knew what was coming, not when, not how, but soon. He didn't want to fight, but if trouble came, he was ready to face it. Not as a soldier, but as a man who understood what real strength meant. And so the calm before the storm continued. A still night before everything would change. He didn't know it yet, but soon his quiet life would be shattered, and the whole town would learn who he really was. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind had stopped moving through the trees, and even the crickets seemed silent. Inside the house, the man sat by the window watching the empty road. He had turned off every light, letting the moon be his only source of brightness. His instincts told him something was about to happen. Years of service had trained him to trust that feeling, the quiet before trouble. For a while, nothing happened. The clock ticked softly, and the sound of his own heartbeat filled the silence. Then faintly he heard it, the sound of engines. More than one, the distant growl of vehicles moving slowly up the dirt road. He took a deep breath and stayed still. He didn't reach for anything, didn't panic. He just watched. Headlights appeared at the bottom of the hill, small dots growing brighter as they came closer. There were several of them. The vehicles stopped near the edge of his yard. The doors opened and shadows stepped out. Laughter carried through the night. Not friendly laughter, but the kind that tries to hide fear behind noise. The man stayed seated. His face was calm, but his mind was sharp and alert. He could tell by the sound of footsteps how many there were. He could hear nervousness in their voices. Some pretending to be brave, others unsure about what they were doing. He knew this kind of behavior came from weakness, not strength. They walked toward his house, their voices louder now. One of them threw something. A can that rolled across the ground and clanged against his porch steps. Another one shouted something, trying to provoke him. Still he didn't move. When they saw no reaction, they became bolder. A rock hit the side of the house. Then another. The sound of glass breaking followed. The man didn't flinch. He was studying every move, every sound, every shadow. He was memorizing faces in the dim light, not with anger, but with calm focus. They thought he was hiding. They laughed and called him names, thinking he was scared. But fear wasn't something he felt anymore. He had seen darker nights, heard louder explosions, faced enemies far more dangerous than this. But this was different. This was home. He could have stepped outside. He could have scared them easily. But he didn't. He knew reacting now would only make things worse. People like this wanted a reason to justify their actions. They wanted to feel powerful. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The men kicked over a few barrels and tore down the small fence he had built with his own hands. They broke flower pots, the ones he had planted to keep busy after leaving the service. The sound of shattering clay echoed through the night. After a while, one of them shouted, "Let's go, he's not coming out." They laughed again, loud and messy, then got back into their trucks. Engines roared, tires spun on the dirt, and soon the sound faded into the distance. The man waited for a full minute before moving. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The cool night air brushed against his face. His yard looked like a storm had passed through. Broken pots, cracked glass, scattered debris. He didn't curse, didn't shout. He simply stood there in silence, letting the moonlight fall on everything. He began cleaning right away. He picked up every broken piece and placed it neatly in a bucket. He swept the porch, straightened the fence, and worked until the first light of dawn. When he finally stopped, his hands were dirty, but his mind was clear. In the morning, neighbors gathered around, whispering among themselves. Some looked sad, others uncomfortable. A few came forward to ask what had happened. He only said some boys got carried away. His calm tone made them even more surprised. A young deputy from the local sheriff's office arrived soon after. He looked around, taking a few photos and writing something in a small notebook. But the man could tell he wasn't taking it very seriously. The deputy asked a few questions, then shrugged. "We'll see what we can do," he said before leaving. The man didn't expect much. He knew how these things worked. As the day went on, word spread through town about the incident. Some people felt guilty for not speaking up earlier. Others said maybe he had done something to provoke them, though no one could name what that might be. Rumors had a way of spreading faster than truth. Later that evening, an older man from town stopped by. He was a retired soldier himself and had always respected the quiet man. He looked around at the damaged yard and asked softly, "You all right?" The man nodded. "I've been through worse." The older veteran studied him for a moment. There was something familiar about his stance, the straight back, the controlled breathing, the sharp eyes. "You've seen action before, haven't you?" he asked quietly. The man smiled faintly but said nothing. The veteran didn't press him. He just nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Over the next few days, people began to talk more openly about what had happened. A few felt brave enough to mention that the ones responsible were a group of young men from nearby, always loud, always trying to show off. They had been seen driving around late at night, drinking and causing trouble, but no one dared confront them directly. The man, however, continued with his daily life as if nothing had changed. He fixed what could be fixed and ignored what couldn't. He still greeted everyone politely in town, though some avoided his eyes out of guilt. He didn't hold it against them. He knew fear made people quiet. At the diner one morning while he was having coffee, he heard two people talking at the counter. One said, "I heard that man used to be in the military. Maybe that's why he's so calm." The other replied, "Yeah, but not just regular military. Someone told me he was something special, like one of those Navy guys." He didn't look up. He just smiled slightly and kept sipping his coffee. Rumors had started to form. Whispers that the quiet man on the hill wasn't just an ordinary person. But no one knew for sure. That evening, he walked to the small lake near his house, as he often did when he needed to think. The reflection of the sky on the water was calm and clear. He sat on a rock and watched the ripples move across the surface. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside. Not anger, but a deep sadness that after everything he had done for his country, he still had to face hate in his own backyard. He closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted peace, the kind he had fought so hard to earn. But peace wasn't something you could force. Sometimes it had to be protected. The next morning, he went into town for supplies. When he parked his truck, he noticed the same group of young men across the street laughing again. One of them pointed at him, pretending to make fun of his calm nature. The man ignored them and went about his errands. But an older woman who saw what was happening approached him quietly. "You be careful," she said softly. "They've been talking nonsense again. They think you're scared." He thanked her for the warning and smiled gently. "Let them think what they want," he replied. When he returned home that evening, he took a slow walk around his property. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. He looked at the broken fence post and thought, I can fix that tomorrow. Then he noticed fresh footprints near his gate, not from any animal. He knelt down, studied them, and followed them a few steps before stopping. He didn't need to go far. He already knew who they belonged to. That night he sat on his porch again, listening to the wind. His face was calm, but his eyes were focused. He had made a decision, not to fight, not to seek revenge, but to be ready. He had learned long ago that readiness was the best defense. He knew they would return. People driven by hate rarely stopped after one attempt. But next time, things would not go the way they expected. Inside his house, everything looked normal, except for the quiet preparation only a trained man would notice. He made sure his lights worked properly, checked his locks, and positioned a few cameras he had bought years ago but never used. He didn't do it out of fear, but out of habit. Preparation was part of who he was. As he sat back down in his chair, the night stretched out before him. He watched the moon rise slowly above the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of engines echoed faintly again, but this time he didn't flinch. He whispered softly, If they come again, they'll learn who I really am, not through anger, but through truth. And with that, he leaned back, calm and ready for whatever the next night would bring. The morning after that quiet night, the man walked down to the town square as he usually did. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky a soft orange. The town looked peaceful, almost pretending that nothing bad ever happened here. People moved around, opening shops, sweeping sidewalks, and greeting one another with polite smiles. When the man walked by, some nodded respectfully, but others looked away. They didn't mean harm, but they didn't know how to act around him anymore. After what had happened, he had become a topic of conversation. Everyone knew his house had been attacked, though no one wanted to say it out loud. He went into the grocery store to buy supplies. The shop owner, an older woman who had known him for years, gave him a kind smile. You holding up okay? She asked softly. I'm fine, he said calmly, setting his items on the counter. She hesitated for a second before lowering her voice. You know, folks around here are saying you used to be in the service. That true? He looked at her, his expression unreadable. I did my time, he said simply. That was all he said, but it was enough to spark more curiosity. People nearby overheard, and by evening the whole town was buzzing with talk. By sunset, different stories began to float around. Some said he was a soldier. Others said he had been in secret missions overseas. A few exaggerated, claiming he was some sort of government agent. No one really knew the truth, but everyone had an opinion. Meanwhile, the same group of men who had caused the trouble heard those rumors too. Instead of feeling cautious, they laughed about it. That old man? A soldier? One of them said at the diner. He's just putting on a tough act. They all laughed, but deep down, one or two of them didn't feel so sure. They remembered how calm he had been, how nothing had shaken him. There was something in that stillness that didn't feel ordinary. A few days later, the man went to the local hardware store to buy materials for repairs. While waiting in line, he heard two veterans talking nearby. They were discussing the news about him, trying to guess his background. One of them said, You can tell by the way he walks, and that's not just some regular man. That's training. The man pretended not to hear. He didn't like attention. For him, serving had never been about glory or titles. It was about duty, and duty didn't end when the uniform came off. Later that day, while fixing his porch, an older gentleman from town drove up and parked by the fence. The man recognized him from the diner, a quiet person known to be a retired Marine. He stepped out, nodded politely, and said, Mind if I have a word? The man smiled faintly and gestured toward a chair on the porch. They sat in silence for a few moments before the visitor said, I heard what happened here. I also heard the talk around town. I don't care much for gossip, but I know the look of someone who's been trained. You've got that stillness in you. The man didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, his eyes on the horizon. I've seen enough of the world, he finally said. I came here because I thought this place was quiet. I just wanted peace, the Marine nodded. Peace is hard to find. But people here, they're starting to realize who you are. Maybe that's a good thing. The man smiled faintly, almost sadly. Maybe. Or maybe it'll just make things harder. The visitor stood up and shook his hand firmly. "You ever need anything, you let me know," he said before driving off. That evening, as the man sat on his porch, the sun dipped low, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. He thought about the Marine's words. Maybe people would see him differently now, but that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want to be a symbol or a mystery. He just wanted to live quietly, but peace wasn't that simple anymore. The next morning, the deputy sheriff came by again. He looked uncomfortable as he walked up the path. "Sir, I just wanted to check on you," he said. "We're keeping an eye on things," the man nodded. "Appreciate that." The deputy shifted his weight. "Also, off the record, folks in town are curious. They're saying you used to be in the Navy. Some of the boys at the station think maybe that's why you handled all this so calm." The man gave a small smile. "Let's just say I've learned how to stay calm." The deputy chuckled nervously, trying to sound casual. "Well, whatever you did, it sure worked. Most people would have lost their temper." After the deputy left, the man looked out over his yard. He could still see faint marks from the night of the attack, places where the grass hadn't grown back yet, the corner of the fence still crooked. He could fix it all, but he left some of it as a reminder, not of anger, but of patience. Days passed and the gossip grew. More people started stopping by his shop. Some just to talk, others pretending to need repairs but clearly wanting to see him up close. Some even thanked him quietly, saying he had inspired them to stay strong in their own struggles. He didn't quite understand it, but he appreciated their kindness. However, not everyone saw it that way. The same men who had caused trouble before didn't like how people were starting to respect him. They felt challenged, as if their little power was slipping away. Their pride couldn't handle it. They began talking again, louder than before. One night at the local bar, they sat together whispering and planning. One of them slammed his glass down and said, "We can't let him make us look weak. He's nothing special." Another, quieter voice said, "What if the stories are true? What if he really was, one of those top Navy guys?" The first one laughed. "Come on, man. He's just an old handyman. You scared of him now?" But the doubt had already started. Even among them, cracks were forming. Back at his house, the man spent his evenings quietly reading or working on small projects. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Trouble doesn't go away just because you ignore it. Still, he had no intention of meeting hate with hate. He believed that dignity was stronger than anger. One afternoon, while he was cleaning his tools, a young man from the town stopped by. He looked nervous. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened," he said softly. "My cousin was with those guys that night. I wasn't, but I should have stopped them. I didn't. I'm sorry." The man looked at him, surprised by the honesty. He put down his tool and said gently, "It takes courage to admit that." "Thank you." The young man nodded, his eyes wet. "They're planning something again," he said suddenly. "I heard them talking. They said they'll go back to your place one more time to finish what they started." The man didn't react with fear. He just asked when. "I don't know. Maybe this weekend." He nodded slowly. "You did the right thing by telling me. Now go home and don't get involved." The young man hesitated. "Aren't you going to call the sheriff?" The man smiled faintly. "I'll handle it." After he left, the man stood in the doorway for a long time, thinking. He didn't want a confrontation, but he also couldn't let things keep going. If they came again, he would have to end it, not with violence, but with truth. That evening, he checked the small security cameras he had placed earlier. Everything was working fine. He made sure his porch light was strong enough to catch faces clearly. He wasn't setting a trap. He was just preparing for evidence. As night fell, he sat outside quietly, the hum of crickets filling the air. He thought about all the people who had trusted him during his service, the men who had followed him into impossible missions, the civilians he had helped in dangerous places, the promise he had made to protect, not destroy. He whispered softly to himself, "You can't fight darkness with more darkness." He went to bed that night knowing that the next few days would test his patience again. But he also knew something else. When the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just change how people saw him. It would change how they saw themselves. Somewhere across town, the same group of men sat together again, their anger growing louder with every drink, their pride blinding them to the mistake they were about to make. And at the edge of the town, under the quiet moonlight, the man who once served as the Supreme Navy SEAL sat in peaceful silence, waiting, not for revenge, but for the moment when truth would finally reveal itself. The weekend arrived with a quiet heaviness in the air. The man could feel it the moment he woke up. There was something different about that morning. The silence felt sharper, like the world was holding its breath. The sky was gray and the wind moved slowly through the trees, bending the branches but never breaking them. He spent the early hours tending to his yard. He fixed the last broken fence post and swept the porch clean. Every action was calm and steady. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary day, but inside he was alert, quietly preparing himself for whatever was coming. He didn't tell anyone what he knew. The young man's warning had been enough. He didn't want others to get involved or afraid. He had faced danger before, much greater than this, and he knew fear could make people do foolish things. He wanted to handle it his own way. In the afternoon, he went into town as usual. People greeted him politely, but there was still that hint of curiosity in their eyes. The rumors about his past had only grown stronger. Some now believed he had once worked on secret missions. Others said he was a retired officer who had trained elite soldiers. The truth was unknown, but the respect in people's voices had started to replace the fear. When he walked into the diner, the same group of troublemakers sat in their usual corner. Their laughter stopped the moment he stepped inside. The man nodded politely to the waitress and took a seat near the window, calmly drinking his coffee. One of the young men muttered something under his breath, and the others laughed, trying to act tough. The man didn't react. He didn't even look in their direction. His calmness bothered them more than any words ever could. When he finished his coffee, he stood up, paid his bill, and said softly to the waitress, "You take care now." Then he walked out. The men watched him leave, their pride stung by the quiet strength they couldn't understand. That night, clouds covered the sky, and the moon disappeared behind them. The darkness was thick and heavy. The man sat inside his house with the lights off, his camera screens glowing faintly in the corner. He had connected them to an old monitor, each showing a different view of his yard. Everything was still. He wasn't nervous. He was patient. Waiting was something he had learned to do well. In the Navy, he had once waited for hours in silence before a mission, listening to nothing but his own breathing. Tonight felt similar. Not a mission, but a moment that required discipline. Around midnight, the sound of engines broke the silence again. He looked at the screens and saw the headlights approaching, just like before. There were more vehicles this time, maybe 3 or 4. They stopped near the same spot as last time. He leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. The group stepped out, their voices muffled but careless. They moved across the yard, flashlights in hand. The man didn't move. His cameras recorded everything, clear faces, clear voices. He wanted the truth to be seen, not through words but through proof. As they got closer to the house, the security lights suddenly turned on, bright and blinding. The men froze, caught off guard. One of them cursed under his breath. The man stepped outside onto his porch, hands at his sides, calm and steady. No weapons, no shouting, just silence. The light shone behind him, casting his tall figure in a way that made him look almost larger than life. The men stared at him, unsure what to do. The leader of the group tried to speak, but his voice shook slightly. We just came to talk," he stammered. The man didn't respond. He simply pointed toward the camera above the porch, its small red light blinking steadily. The group followed his gaze. They realized in that moment that everything was being recorded. Their confidence began to fade. One of them took a step back. Another whispered something nervously. The man spoke then, his voice calm, deep and steady. "You came here once before." I said nothing. "You came again." I stayed silent. "But now I think it's time everyone knows what's really happening." The leader tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. "What are you gonna do? Show it to the cops?" The man didn't answer. He simply said, "Truth has a way of showing itself." Before any of them could reply, a car's headlights appeared down the road. The men froze again, thinking it was the police. But it was one of the neighbors, the same older veteran who had visited before. He stepped out holding a flashlight. When he saw what was happening, he called out, "Everything all right here?" The man nodded. "Everything's fine now." The troublemaker shifted uneasily. The veteran looked at them closely, recognizing a few faces. "You boys should head home," he said firmly. This isn't how grown men act. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, they began backing away toward their vehicles. Their pride was broken, their courage gone. The red light on the camera kept blinking, recording every second. When they finally drove off, the man and the veteran stood there quietly. The older man asked softly, "You okay?" "I'm fine," he replied. "There'll be two." The veteran smiled knowingly. "You didn't have to say much, did you?" The man shook his head. Sometimes silence is enough. The next morning, the whole town was talking again, but this time the story was different. Someone had seen the video, or at least a piece of it. It showed the men arriving at night, clearly caught on camera. The sheriff's office received a copy anonymously, and by noon, the men were called in for questioning. When the news spread, people's opinions changed completely. The quiet man on the hill was no longer seen as a victim. He was seen as someone who had handled hate with remarkable calm and dignity. That afternoon, the man was sitting on his porch when the older veteran returned. He had a proud smile on his face. "You know," he said, "I think people are finally starting to see who you really are." The man looked at him, his eyes gentle. "Who I really am doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that they saw what hate looks like and what peace looks like beside it." The veteran nodded slowly. "You've got a rare kind of strength." The man smiled faintly. "It's not strength, it's control. That's what most people don't understand. You don't need to fight to win." The next few days brought quiet change. People who had once ignored him started waving when they saw him in town. A few even stopped by to apologize for not helping earlier. The sheriff came himself, offering his apologies for not taking things seriously before. The man accepted them all with grace. But he didn't talk about what had happened. He didn't share his video online or try to humiliate anyone. He let the law handle it quietly. He believed dignity meant knowing when to stop. One afternoon, while he was working in his yard, a reporter from a nearby town stopped by. She had heard about the story and wanted to interview him. "People are saying you used to be someone important in the Navy," she said. "Is that true?" He looked up from his work, his hands dusty but steady. "I served my country," he said simply. "That's all that matters." "But they say you were more than that," she pressed gently. "That you were a top officer, maybe even part of something special." The man gave a small smile and shook his head. "Titles don't mean much. What matters is what you do when no one's watching." She paused, realizing she wouldn't get any more details from him, then smiled. "You've got a lot of people talking. I think they see you as a symbol of calmness and strength." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked toward the sunset and said quietly, "If people learn to respond with patience instead of anger, then maybe all this happened for a reason." When she left, he sat back on his porch again, the wind moving softly through the trees. The town had changed, not completely, but enough. People had seen what hate looked like when met with peace. They had seen strength that didn't need to shout. As the evening sky turned golden, the man looked around his repaired yard, now quiet again. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had handled it his way, not with violence, but with discipline, wisdom, and calm. The storm had passed and the truth had started to shine through. But the story wasn't finished yet. Soon the world would learn exactly who he was, not because he told them, but because the truth always finds a way to rise. He took a slow breath, looked up at the fading sky, and whispered softly, "Peace always wins in the end." The sun rose softly over the small town, painting everything with shades of gold. The air felt lighter than it had in weeks. The man sat quietly on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the light spread across his yard. The grass was growing again, the fence was repaired, and the damage that once stood as a painful reminder was now almost gone. Peace had finally returned, but peace was never something he took for granted. It had to be protected, not with weapons, but with wisdom. The last few days had been calm. The men who had come to his house were now facing consequences. The sheriff had handled it quietly, avoiding the kind of attention that could stir up more trouble. But even so, everyone in town knew what had happened. People whispered less now and greeted more. The energy had shifted. Respect had taken the place of gossip. The man had kept to himself, just as before. He didn't look for thanks or attention. He went to the diner for breakfast, worked in his yard, and helped a few neighbors with small repairs. But there was something different in the way people looked at him now. There was gratitude, admiration, and maybe even a little awe. One morning, the sheriff stopped by again. He stepped out of his car and walked up to the porch with a hesitant smile. "Hope I'm not bothering you," he said. The man shook his head. "You're not." The sheriff looked around at the neatly repaired yard. "Place looks better than ever," he said. "It's getting there," the man replied softly. The sheriff stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin. "I wanted to tell you something," he said finally. "There's been talk, good talk. People around town have been asking about you. Some even called the local paper. They want to write about what happened here." The man's face stayed calm. "I'd rather not," he said. "Stories can twist things. I don't want this to turn into something it's not." The sheriff nodded. "I figured you'd say that, but there's more. Someone higher up saw the report and the footage you sent. They recognized you." The man looked up slightly, his eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. "Recognize me?" "Yes," the sheriff said. "From the Navy. They called me this morning. Said they know exactly who you are, and that you've done more for this country than most people will ever know." For a long moment, the porch was silent except for the sound of the wind. The man didn't speak, didn't move. He just looked out at the trees, lost in thought. Finally, he said quietly, "I've been out of that life for years." "I know," the sheriff replied. "But they want to honor you. They're sending someone down next week, some officer from Washington. They want to meet you in person." The man didn't answer right away. He just gave a small sigh. "I never wanted attention," he said, "but if it helps this town heal, I'll do it." The sheriff smiled, relief in his eyes. "It will. People need heroes right now. Real ones." Over the next few days, word spread quickly that someone important was coming to town. People didn't know all the details, but they guessed it had something to do with the quiet man on the hill. The diner filled with talk again, but this time the tone was different. People spoke with pride instead of judgment. The day finally arrived. A black SUV pulled into town, and a small group of uniformed officers stepped out. The townspeople gathered, quietly near the diner, watching curiously as they walked up the road toward the man's house. The man was waiting on his porch, dressed simply in a clean shirt and jeans. His posture was calm, his expression peaceful. The lead officer, a tall woman in formal uniform, approached him with respect. "Sir?" she said, offering a salute. "It's an honor to meet you again." He nodded politely. "It's been a long time," she smiled. "Too long. The Navy never forgets its best." The people watching from a distance couldn't believe what they were seeing. The man who had lived quietly among them, who had repaired fences and shared coffee at the diner, was being saluted by officers from the Navy. Whispers spread quickly. The officer turned to the small group behind her and said, "This man once served his country at the highest level of service. He led missions that saved countless lives. He was known as one of the most disciplined and skilled Navy SEALs in the nation, and he never once sought recognition for it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The townspeople stood in awe. The man simply lowered his gaze, uncomfortable with the attention. The officer continued, "When we learned what happened here, we weren't surprised at how he handled it. Calm, controlled, with dignity. That's who he's always been." She then reached into her pocket and took out a small medal, shining softly in the sunlight. "This isn't an award for what happened recently," she said. "It's a symbol of respect and for your years of service and for showing the world that true strength is not about violence. It's about peace." She pinned the medal gently onto his shirt. The man looked at it for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. The crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. People who had once ignored him now stood with tears in their eyes. Some clapped, Some smiled. A few whispered apologies to each other for ever doubting him. The man didn't bask in the praise. He simply looked around and said softly, "I didn't do anything special. I just refused to hate back." After the ceremony, the officers left and the town slowly went back to its rhythm, but nothing was quite the same. The man who had once been just a quiet neighbor was now a symbol of what it meant to stay strong without losing kindness.